Hello. You know, I'm here in my library checking out my collection of audiobooks. I started listening to audiobooks a few years ago because I've got a kind of a longish commute to work, about 2 hours total each day, and it really is a great way to spend the time. I highly recommend it. It's also a lot of fun to listen to audiobooks while you're doing household chores like mowing the lawn. Similarly to other YouTubers, I'm asking that if you enjoy my videos, please subscribe so you don't miss any in the future, and like them and leave comments. It's easy and fun to do. If you're not familiar with Audible, it's an Amazon-owned service that charges a monthly fee of $14.99 and you get 1 book credit. That may sound steep to some, but it's less expensive than buying titles on audio CDs. I enjoy a variety of literary genres, fiction and nonfiction equally. Lately, I've been indulging myself in music and music business-related titles, biographies, autobiographies, and historic tales of the early days of popular music. Getting into home audio starts with the music, and my enthusiasm for music-related things extends to the point where I want to learn the stories of the artists and their backgrounds, the songs, touring, personal lives, and even the record industry. I always buy the unabridged long versions of audiobooks because one time I accidentally bought an abridged biography of Albert Einstein, and I felt a bit shortchanged at the end of it. In this video, I'd like to talk to you about a few of my favorite music-themed audiobooks. Obviously, I tend to favor stories about my favorite bands that I enjoy, but I also like to branch out into some stuff that I'm less familiar with. Almost as important as the words on the page, on an audiobook, the narrator's performance can enhance or spoil the experience. I've given up and returned numerous books to Audible because I didn't like the quality of the narration. Let's begin. First up in my recommended list is a memoir titled Life by Keith Richards. As a Rolling Stones fan, hearing the stories about his early life and start of the band was of great interest to me. Keith apparently has excellent recall, and if anyone has amazing stories to tell, it's him. The book is narrated by Johnny Depp, Keith, and an actor doing a Keith impression. It's not as weird as it sounds. I enjoyed it tremendously. He has a particularly unique writing style, and his candor is admirable. He goes into great detail about songwriting, recording, drug busts, addiction, fame, relationships, dealings with the law, and how he really feels about Mick Jagger. The exhilarating flavor of the 1960s and 70s really come across in this memoir. As with most stories like his, the climb and struggle from being an unknown London blues band to superstardom is the most detailed and interesting part of the story. Events that occur over days, weeks, and months are described thoroughly, and as he reaches middle age later in the book, years and decades simply fly by. So, what did I learn at the end of this book? Well, being a Rolling Stone obviously is awesome and totally cool. While Keith was battling addiction and legal woes, Mick assumed total control of the band from that point forward. And, Keith lost some respect for Mick Jagger as Mick strived to climb the social ladder and, in Keith's opinion, totally sold out. I very highly recommend this title to any Rolling Stones fan or music fan in general. Actually, I believe in this case, listening to the audiobook is a more enjoyable experience than reading it. Next, I'm going to discuss 3 books together. These are the books about members of The Who. Now, there's Thanks a Lot, Mr. Kibblewhite by Roger Daltrey, Who I Am by Pete Townsend, and The Ox by Paul Rees.
Fillmore East, New York.
My favorite of the 3 Who books was Daltrey's. He narrates it himself and does an excellent job. The thing I like about him is that he appears to remain a plain-spoken, regular, working-class geezer. His London shepherd's bush accent is still there, and his storytelling is straightforward and entertaining. I like that Daltrey doesn't gloss over the warts and difficult periods in his personal story. Although Townsend was the driving and the creative force in the band, Roger was the ever-vigilant member who understood, the art of stagecraft and set lists, and he was also the most fiscally responsible member of the group. Roger relates the tale of The Who from the point of view as the lead singer and founding member. Remember, the original band, the Detours, were started by schoolmates Roger and bassist John Entwistle. Pete Townshend joined a couple years later, and Keith Moon joined sometime after that. Daltrey was the tough guy in the band, and often settled disagreements with his fists. That made him rather unpopular with his bandmates. For example, early on, Roger did not indulge in the fashionable drugs of that era, and became frustrated when the others showed up to gigs speeding on uppers and playing much too fast. When Roger disposed of their pill stash and knocked out an angry Keith Moon, they temporarily fired him. Roger reads this book with feeling and authenticity. If you're only going to read one book about a former Who member, this is the one to get. Now, what I learned after reading this book is, well, one interesting thing was, although Roger was married to his wife since the early 70s, the couple had an understanding that he could indulge his desires while he was out on the road for long periods of time. And this resulted in at least one surprise offspring daughter who popped up in the early 2000s. Another thing I learned that because of his diligence, he was the one who discovered that their two heroin addict managers were the ones who were stealing or borrowing money from the band's funds to support their extravagant lifestyles. And Pete Townshend kind of ignored it and kind of glossed over it for a long time until eventually they did have to fire them. And this is something that Pete Townshend doesn't even barely discuss in his book. That's very interesting.
But exciting. I got hold of some...
Now, Pete Townshend's autobiography, Who I Am, is a self-narrated title. And as the primary songwriter and guitarist and sometimes singer of the band, of course he has a lot to say about that. But Pete was a very sensitive child who had a very active imagination. And as he got older, he really dreamed of a career in the arts and went to art college. And he became totally engaged in all matters of creativity while he was there, and really didn't have any ideas of, being a musician. He really wanted to be some kind of visual artist. Obviously, hearing the story from Pete's perspective is interesting, and Townshend spent his early life pursuing spiritualism and inner peace, but ended up as a big egomaniac and rock star who's desperately pursuing drugs and drinking and women and trying to maintain a family life at home. He does candidly reveal much about his personal shortcomings, but he skips over too many important incidents from the years when the Who were at their peak, and which are described in detail in Daltrey's and Entwistle's book, which was kind of frustrating for me. And in my opinion, there were way too many chapters are devoted to, his post-Who decades of the 80s and 90s, when he was a book editor, publisher, and some of his solo and stage projects, like website stuff and activities and charities. There were way too much of that in there, and not enough of the Who years, in my opinion.
The Who still now lacked was their own material, and of the kind that Lennon and McCartney...
Next up, I'm going to talk about is The Ox, which is the biography of John Entwistle that was written with the cooperation of musician's family and who helped the writer, get his material together. This book was a real surprise to me. Now, I knew Entwistle was a brilliant bass player, and he died suddenly in 2002, age 58, in Las Vegas on the eve of the tour. But I didn't know much else about him, to be honest. He was the most musically talented in the band, who could play a variety of instruments, and he was a gifted songwriter with some wonderful and offbeat songs. Although he was known as the quiet one in the band, he genuinely lived a rock and roll lifestyle with a multitude of fancy cars, a huge English mansion and estate, hundreds of guitars, as well as the associated drugs, booze, and ladies. He kept the partying going until the end and loved touring and gigging. On stage is where he felt most at home and appreciated the adulation of his fans very much. The narration on this book is just fine. It's nothing spectacular. It's fine. It's maybe a little forgettable, but I didn't have any problems with it. This is an excellent book for a Who fan that only had maybe a vague notion of what John Entwistle was like. The book seems pretty honest and doesn't smooth over any of his shortcomings at all. One thing I learned about John Entwistle was that he loved to shop, and he was really into shopping at Harrods department store in London. And he really enjoyed the fact that his neighbors could see the green Harrods van make its deliveries to the front door of the house. And his best friend was during that time was Keith Moon, the drummer. And Keith was known for his hijinks and crazy antics, but a lot of the stuff that Keith Moon did were actually John's ideas, and he kind of egged him on to do all those crazy things. Another thing was that because John Entwistle led such a extravagant lifestyle, that he was often scrambling for cash, and he had to tour a lot with his own band just to keep the lights on. He really lived it up.
When he took a call from an underling at Atlantic Records.
Wow.
The label wanted to book time.
Crosby, Stills, and Nash & Young were a genuine phenomenon in the early 70s. They struck a chord with the public early on with their first couple of mega hit releases, and then they spent the following decades trying to find that spark again as solo artists and back together as a group. And the writer, David Brown, does an admirable job researching and telling the story of the world's most dysfunctional supergroup. All four members of the band achieved various levels of success in their own bands during the 1960s, and the band's history starts when, during the summer of '68, Crosby, Stills, and Nash were all living in Los Angeles and sang together for the first time at either the house of Mama Cass Elliot or Joni Mitchell. The trio released a self-titled record in 1969, and that was an instant hit with the public. Soon afterwards, they recruited Neil Young into the band, and the record that emerged from that partnership in 1970, Deja Vu, was a chart-topping smash. What follows, though, is another tale of rock and roll excess: money, sex, drugs, alcohol, addiction, legal woes, egos, jealousy, ambition, and wasted opportunities. It's long, almost 23 hours, but it's a fascinating tale. It's never boring. The narration is very good. And if you're a fan or curious about what all the fuss is about, this story is for you.